All right, guys, so we've got all the walnut side panels mounted into the frames, and they're looking spectacular. And you can see that book match just came out so beautifully. All the book matches on these, the book match held strong, even though I had to do a little bit more sanding than I would have liked to. They still all have a really good book match to them, and it's going to look so good once we get some oil in there. And so you can see here just how that epoxy works. Basically, it's just filling those knot holes. It's going to be pure black once you put some oil on it. Right now, it's a little bit of a cloudy gray. That's just because there's some dust on it. But once you get some oil in there, it'll clear up a little bit and look a lot better. And so quickly, if you just go over how this actually works, like I mentioned before, this is the same way that you would mount in a pane of glass into a rabbet. So ideally, if you're doing this with glass, you would do it a hell of a lot nicer. Again, the reason that this looks so bad right now is purely because this is going to be an internal component. You're never going to see it again once we actually build these things. This is going to get completely covered up with all those maple, and it's going to be behind all the drawers. So all these little strips they're just 3/16 thick by 1/4 inch wide strips of maple that I cut down from just some random stock that I had left over. And so you might be wondering whether or not these strips are as strong as actually having a solid groove going through the white oak. And as far as I can tell, they're just as strong, if not a little bit stronger, because there's really no flex to the panel at all. Like I can push on the front of the panel, there's no flex back here. And so, as you guys saw me do, what I did is I just put a small bead of glue right in the corner, and then I tacked this in with 23 gauge pin nails. And now what we need to go through and do is prepare our leg stock to actually glue all the side panels together. Because now that we have these all put together, we have all of those maple pieces that are all fitted up, ready to go into the mortises that are already in the legs, we can actually put our sidewalls together and start getting ready to actually put the structure of each of these pieces together. Alright, so we now have all of our dowel holes drilled into all of our side pieces, but with that completed, the next thing we need to do is cut the groove for the tall dresser's cabinet side panel. So I've been dreading that I'm going to forget doing this, so I'm just going to get it done. So all we're doing is just cutting a 1/4 inch groove, basically from the top of the tall dresser on the inside of the right side, all the way down to the middle stretcher where we transition from 5/8 inch to 3/4 inch thick stock. And so all this side panel does, it's nothing structural, nothing's really going to be built into it. The only purpose of it is to enclose that cabinet area. And we're going to be drilling some shelf pins into it later on. But the main purpose of it is just to clean up that inner cabinet area so that we're hiding the kind of uglier inside of those side panels that we built before. And so the most important part of this is having some kind of guide or reference to keep your router square against your stock. Now Bosch makes some really nice edge guides. They've got like micro adjust, all that stuff. They work really good. They're fairly expensive, but they do function quite well. The ideal way to do this is to build something like this base that I've got on my router right here. And so the main benefit of this is that I can set this up on my leg, get my bit aligned where I need it to be, and then bring both of these guides in tight up against the leg. This will give me a perfect guideline all the way down the length of the leg here so that I'm cutting a perfectly straight groove, and there's no chance of veering to the left or the right just because if my guide were to come off the edge of the leg, or I just move the router weirdly. So this is a very good, safe option. The only trick here, you just got to be careful not to let it bind, so you want to keep these inner areas really well waxed up using like paste wax or just some paraffin wax. All right, so the last thing we got to do before we can put these side panels together is we need to cut the top mortise. I'm pretty sure it's a mortise. It's open on one side, so I don't know if it's still technically a mortise. Probably has some other random name that I don't know about, but I'm just going to call it a mortise for now. So what I've done in the past when I have these mortises that are really close to one of the ends of the leg is that I've always just cut them with the mortiser and just left that same 3/16 gap. Now, generally with that 3/16 piece of end grain that's on the top there, it'll break out before you actually get around to putting the tenon in there. And so that hasn't really been a big issue in the past, because what I've done is when I go to do the glue up, I just glue that piece of end grain back on, then clean it all up with the hand plane. You'd never notice the difference, and it's not in a place that you're ever going to see anyway, so it's really not that big of a deal. But what I wanted to try doing in this project is just doing something a little bit more intentional and just cutting a square right here that I could then drop a tenon into. Initially, in my plans, what I was planning to do was to do a half blind dovetail, but then I realized that that's just not really this is not really a spot where it's worth the effort, because this piece is not really going to get pulled apart, and going through the effort of putting a half blind dovetail up here, that's a decent amount of time. That's probably a whole day to get all of these legs, these top stretchers in place, and it's just not really worth it. So now we've cut all the joinery that we need to cut into these legs, and now we can start assembling the side panels. Alright, and so for the glue up, there's a few things that you guys might be wondering about here. So first off, obviously I went through and cleaned up everything with the hand plane. Now I really like using the hand plane to do any of this kind of quick cleanup because it lets me just completely skip through sanding. I can go straight from the hand plane to 220 grit, and the hand plane does all the work of getting off any milling marks that are left on, or just any kind of nicks or dings that I've put into the wood while it's just kind of existed in the shop here. And so in my low angle jack, I've got a freshly sharpened 50-degree blade, and so the reason I'm using a 50-degree blade is purely because I want as clean a finish as I can possibly get. The higher your blade angle in a low angle jack, the more resistant it is to tear out. So anywhere where you may have grain changing in these legs, I just want to make sure that I'm not tearing it out, because at this stage, I don't have a lot of material to spare if I do get a pretty bad section of tear out. So using that 50-degree blade is really handy. Then from the low angle jack, I just finish everything off with some hand sanding at 220 grit. This just makes sure everything is the same surface finish. Because if you start to mix components that are only hand planed with components that are only sanded, they do have a visual difference in the end. The hand planed surfaces are going to have a little bit more shiny, glossy finish, compared to the sanded surfaces are going to be a little bit more matte. The other thing you might be wondering if you've watched some of my other projects is why I didn't do any pre-finishing on this. In the past, I've been a big supporter of pre-finishing your work before you do a glue up because it really makes it easy to clean up the squeeze out. So right now I've got the squeeze out just kind of in all the areas you would expect it, anywhere where my tendons are going into my legs, and where I put the dowels in, obviously there's going to be some squeeze out. Now the trick is with pre-finishing is it would make getting that squeeze out off a lot easier, because especially when you're using a traditional oil finish like I use, the surface is oily enough and that resists the water-based glue enough that it just kind of slices right off easily. Now, the only problem that I've been running into lately using that technique is that if you have a piece like this that we're going to be continuing to work on further, it makes it a lot harder to handle, because now that it's finished, it's very hard to sand or even hand plane it, because that oil is there. It slicks up the surface a little bit. When you cut into it with a hand plane, it even kind of slicks up the blade and makes it hard to cut, and you can't sand it anymore. So if you get marks on it, or you just have some grime on your fingertips, it's very hard to get out. All right, guys, so I'm working on assembling the side panels for the tall dresser, and we've run into a minor issue. Now, I knew this was going to be an issue all along, and I was just hoping that I was going to find a better solution than the one that I'm going to be using. So the solution that I'm going to be using is probably one that's going to piss a lot of people off, and is probably going to lose me a few subscribers. And honestly, it is what it is. There is no better way to do this. So let me show you guys what the problem is. And so on the top and bottom, our stretchers are lined up nicely with our legs. There's just a small offset, which is exactly what I wanted it to be. But then if you look into the middle, you can see that it kind of dishes down. So on this side, it's a lot worse. We've got probably close to 1/4 inch of deflection in the middle area. And so the trick here is that I need some way to keep this panel pushed outwards so that it's sitting nice and true. Now, ideally what I would have done here is go in and put some dowels in, or dominoes, something like that, to help keep that alignment. Or I could have put in a cross piece in the middle here. That would have been the more traditional, ideal option, but that would have broken up our nice long panels and would have kind of ruined the design overall. So dowels or dominoes, again, would have been the ideal. The only problem with that is I don't really have a good way to align that stuff either. I was thinking about buying the Jessam dowel jig, but doing more research into that, I realized that that wouldn't really help with aligning anything either. So I just decided to forego that. So now what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be using pocket hole screws, everyone's favorite joinery method, my personal favorite joinery method, if I do say so myself, to just create that strength in these panels. So I should say it, I don't like pocket hole screws. Just in general, I don't really have a problem with people using screws and nails and that in fine furniture, but pocket hole screws generally are used inappropriately for, really crappy joinery. And so what we're doing here is we're not actually creating a structural joint. We're just creating something to hold this panel in place that will allow for some wood movement. So again, this is the important thing, is the pocket hole screws will still allow for some wood movement, but won't allow for as much deflection as we have here. This is kind of one of those situations where I think that pocket hole screws are going to be the best option. Now, it should be said that I am terrified to put in these pocket hole screws, because all I really know about screws and wood is that if you don't pre-drill holes, it splits out the wood. And so with pocket hole screws, you start by pre-drilling that one big hole that's going to be going on our side panel here, but then you don't do any pre-drilling into our side post here. You just let the screw go in. And so I've done a bunch of tests on a bunch of scrap pieces all around my shop. I've done this a bunch of times. I can't even count how many. And I haven't had any breakouts yet, but that being said, I know that when I get onto here, I'm going to have some issue. And so again, like I said, this really is the only option I have to prevent these panels from deflecting inwards. Alright, so the pocket hole screws are now in, and for the most part, they work. They pulled the sidewalls just a little bit closer to the legs. I did have one of the pocket hole screws strip out. The head just broke off because it got over torqued. The Craig products are absolute garbage. We all know it. So I don't recommend them whatsoever. But anyway, I think the stripped one is on the bottom side here. So we still have a little bit of that screw actually holding things together, just creating that alignment. So it'll work. Again, this is the most unideal way of doing this. If I could go back in time, I would definitely do dowels or something for alignment, because that is a far better method than stupid pocket hole screws. So this is just a little bit of an oversight on my part. Again, it's a good learning lesson. The panels don't look any different doing them one way or the other, but adding the pocket hole screws is just, it's kind of it hurts my ego a little bit. So the real trick is here. Would I recommend doing this with pocket hole screws? No. Should you have a pocket hole jig in your shop? Probably, because it can kind of come in clutch when you have stuff like this where there really is no other option at the point that we were at.